Groundhog Day came and went. I didn't really pay attention. What was the issue with that? Did anybody know what?
Early spring.
An early spring? Is that what he's saying? All right. One of my friends actually changed that a little bit and worded it this way. If the pastor wakes up and sees his shadow, there'll be 6 more weeks of the same sermon series. That made me laugh. And I will say this, I just finished a series in 1 John in Sunday school, so we're making progress. And we just did finish this little mini-series here a little bit ago. So anyway, I break them up into smaller series just to make us feel better. At least it makes me feel better. We'll see how it does for you. But anyway, we just wrapped up last week this first of 4, the 4th message in a series, looking at stabilizing truths in an unstable world. And in all seriousness, I trust that you will reflect on those truths. I trust that they're not going to be something that just kind of goes through your mind and you jump right to the next thing. I really hope that you'll think upon them and meditate on them in the days ahead. When difficulties and trials come to your life, I pray that they will become your default setting. Something hard happens and your first thought isn't anxiety and panic. It's, wait a second, you know what? This is hard, but God still loves me. Because God's love for me will never change. And maybe you go to the next step and you say, wow, this is tough, but God, I know that you're doing something through this. You're working in this to conform me to the image of your Son. God, thank you for that. And then you'll get to the point where you say, this is hard and I can't see any good in this at all. But God, I'm going to trust your word. I know your word to me is always right. And when your word says you'll never leave me nor forsake me, I'm going to claim that promise. And that you're working this together for my good, I'm going to claim that promise. And then what I looked at last week, God's grace is sufficient. There's times it doesn't seem like it. When we're in the middle of a trial and we're just going through it and it's hard and it's continuing forever. But we come back and we rest and we anchor ourselves to that truth. Because it is true. Our emotions, they'll fluctuate. God's word is true and it's solid and we need to anchor ourselves to them. So I trust that you will do that. I trust it'll change your default setting to help us to think biblically instead of emotionally when the difficulties of life come. You know, as I was working through that last message last week, it was interesting how many reminders God brought to my mind of times where God has done just that in my life. Man, there's been some hard things. Some difficulties that we've gone through trials and failures and times of brokenness, times of just incredible, overwhelming sorrow. And yet in every single one of those instances, God's grace has been sufficient. There's never been a time when it wasn't. My friend, I don't know what you're going through today, but that promise stands just as true for you as it does for me, as it did for the Apostle Paul. God's grace is sufficient. Rest in that. Anchor yourself to that truth. You know, Sunday night I went to bed and my throat felt a little funny, so I didn't think too much of it. I obeyed my wife and took a vitamin C because that's what you're supposed to do. And then I went to bed and I woke up a little bit later and just felt horrible. You know, that sore throat that's so bad you can't swallow to start with, but when you finally do, it just feels like it's ripping your throat apart. And I'm a guy, so it's probably not only half as bad as I'm making it out to be. But it felt terrible. And I've just been fighting all week with weakness and fogged head. And I told the kids in Sunday school, I worked on the Sunday school lesson. I came back the next day and I read through it and said, that didn't make any sense at all. So I had to kind of rework it. And it's been one of those weeks. As I've been thinking about that, with the message that I preached last week about God's grace being sufficient in our times of weakness, the irony was not lost on me. I think God's still doing some work in my life and trying to help me to rely upon Him. And I took time this week to thank Him for this time of sickness. Because I need to learn to practice what I preach just as much as you need to learn to practice what I preach. It's important that we both work on that together. And so it was a good opportunity for me to rely intentionally upon the strength of God. I've been thinking where to go from here. Obviously, we're getting into 1 Peter, but with that, there's usually an introductory lesson of some sort where you look at the historical background, where you look at the author, the recipients, the purpose for writing, and I still want to do that. But I also love the character Peter in the Bible. He's one of my favorites. And I can't let the opportunity go without taking a little bit of time and looking at his life. And so over the next 2 weeks, we're going to look at a biography of Peter. Look at the life of this apostle, this disciple. You know, in a sense, the life of Peter is a really good object lesson for what we studied last week. It really is. It fits perfectly with what we've been talking about. You know, God gave Paul a thorn in the flesh, didn't he? And the purpose of that was to keep him from boasting, to keep him from relying upon himself, to keep him relying on divine strength. And God worked a similar outcome in the life of Peter. I went about it a little bit differently, but it was a similar outcome. Peter was a strong man. Peter was self-reliant. He was a bit hard-headed. I laugh, I think Peter would have made a pretty good Montanan. Right? I mean, he would have fit in this culture that we live in here in Montana. He was a natural leader. He was gifted in a lot of ways. I think ways we don't even give him credit for, but we see later on in his life. And yet, he needed to be broken of his self-dependency and broken of his pride before he could truly be used the way God wanted to use him. And so with Paul and Peter, we see two different men. And we see two different processes that God used, but the same outcome. You know, for Paul, we talked about the thorn in the flesh, a physical ailment of some sort that was extremely painful, that really bothered him. What was it for Peter? For Peter, it was a profound failure. A fall flat on your face kind of moment. And one that occurred so quickly after boasting of his allegiance to Christ that there was absolutely no way he could miss the connection between the two. So for Paul and Peter, these words ring true. My grace is sufficient for you. My strength is made perfect in weakness. My friends, they'll ring true for us as we go through these hard experiences, as long as we allow God to do the work that he's trying to do in our life. If we join hands with him, if we work together with him instead of fighting against what he's trying to do. Well, with that in mind, let's turn our attention to this man, Peter. So much that we could say. We realize that he was one of the first disciples that was chosen. He was one of 3 disciples chosen to author a book of the New Testament. Think about the other 2 would have been Matthew and John. He became the leader of the disciples, whether that was self-proclaimed or whether he just naturally worked into that position. But he also became a leader very quickly in the early church after he was restored back to his fit place of fellowship with Christ. Peter's name occurs 210 times in the New Testament. That's remarkable. The Apostle Paul, his name occurs 162 times. Now, we see Peter in the Gospels. We don't see Paul in the Gospels. That's part of it. But if you take all of the 11 disciples and you combine their names, their listings in the New Testament, it's only 142 times. It helps us to get an idea of how much of an importance Peter plays in the New Testament scriptures that God's given to us. As I said before, we'll take 2 weeks to complete this study. Today we want to look at Peter's life from before he met Christ until his failure there in the garden and in the courtyard. And this dramatic denial, we'll talk about that a little bit towards the end of the message. So we'll divide our message up into 3 sections. First of all, Peter the fisherman. And then we'll see Peter the follower, the disciple, and then finally Peter the failure. And that'll be kind of a hard spot to leave Peter, but I think it'll be beneficial for us. I want to remind us as we go into this that we're studying real people. Peter was a real man. He really lived. He really fished. He really had a family. He had a wife. He had a mother-in-law. So often we read these stories and we just maybe we put these people up on a pedestal, or we don't think about the fact that they had real lives. He got up every morning and went to work, just like you guys did when you had jobs. Some of you are retired and you don't have to do that anymore. But we need to understand that what their real life was like. And I think about Peter in that regard. And we don't have a lot of scriptural information. We can learn a little bit from history. But we realize that Peter was a fisherman. A natural occupation, I think, for Peter to get into. His hometown would have played an important role in that choice. Where was he from? Well, John tells us he was from the city of Bethsaida. Bethsaida is at the top of the Sea of Galilee, on the north side, just on the east side of the Jordan River. You know, you grow up on the lake, you're probably going to learn how to fish. It's a natural type of a thing. The location would have played a role in that. His social standing, I think, also played a role in that choice of becoming a fisherman. You know, today in America, it doesn't really matter where you're born or what social status you have when you're born. You know, if you work hard and you get an education and you do all these different things, you have enough drive, you can work yourself into kind of whatever you want to do. It wasn't quite that way in first century Israel. It wasn't easy to move up the ladder, so to speak. If you were born into a blue-collar home, you were going to find yourself having a blue-collar job. That's just the way it was. And so it wouldn't have had to have been fishing, but his proximity there, we don't know anything really about his father. Was his dad a fisherman? Did his dad pass away? We don't know. All it's mentioned is that he is Peter, the son of Jonah. And we see that a couple of different times. But fishing was a common occupation in the first century. One of the historians that I was reading said during the time of Christ, there were over 230 fishing boats working the Sea of Galilee during that time period. That's a lot. That's a lot of people invested in that occupation. Fish was an important part of the diet, both for Jews and for Romans. Even Herod realized the importance of this occupation, the economic importance. And he made significant investments in the infrastructure in that area, trying to make fishing a profitable endeavor. Why? Because they needed the food, they needed to eat. It was an important part of their diets. And so they can thank Herod to some degree for that. From what I read, the Sea of Galilee produced 3 main species of fish. How many of you guys are fishermen? Isn't that a logical question? Well, what were they fishing for? Were they fishing for perch or trout? Or it wasn't that. How many have been to Israel? How many of you had a fish to eat while you were in Israel? Susan? What was it called?
Tilapia.
Tilapia. And what was it known as? What do they usually call it when they served it to you? St. Peter's fish. Did you ever hear that term used? That's often how it's known, but it is a type of tilapia. That's the main fish that they would catch there in the Sea of Galilee. They'd also catch carp and catfish even. Now, a Jewish person wouldn't eat the catfish because it didn't fit their dietary laws, but they could sell it to the Romans and make money off of it that way. And so those were the fish that they would catch. This might make you lose your appetite. There was also another product, a byproduct of the fishing industry that was even $1 million industry in that time, from what I understand. And they would take the entrails of the fish after they cleaned them. They would take smaller fish that didn't quite make the market standards, and they would throw those in a vat, and they would fill it to the top. They'd salt it heavily, and then they would seal it up and leave it in the sun to rot and ferment. And then they would pour the juice off of that after a certain amount of time, and they would actually sell that. And they called it garum or garum. You can still buy it today. It's fish sauce. And it said that the Romans used that in almost every single one of their meals. How many of you guys are going to think, I'm going to go to the store and buy some of that? That sounds great. But they used it. They made money off of it. It doesn't sound real appetizing to me. Tilapia doesn't sound bad. The fish sauce, I don't know. But it was interesting. They made a lot of money doing that. Fishing was all a family affair in that period of time. Here we see Peter and Andrew working as partners. We see James and John fishing with their father Zebedee and then being in partnership with Peter and Andrew. They had a fishing business that they were doing there. And if you've owned your own business, you understand that there's ups and downs with that. Peter would have experienced that in the business that he was in there with these other gentlemen. It was evidently a decent-sized business because one of the accounts that we see, they even have day laborers that are working with them in the course of that business. So it was an important thing. Fishing was a natural occupation. It was a common occupation. Letter C, it was also a difficult occupation. This was not an occupation for the faint of heart. If you struggle a little more getting up in the morning and working hard, you might be better off to go to McDonald's and be a server there as opposed to becoming a fisherman in the first century. It was done with boats, generally, sometimes from the shore. They used casting nets, they used drag nets. Both options were available. It's interesting, the boats, from my research, 23 to 27 feet long, 7 to 8 feet wide. I was remembering back in the mid-'80s, they actually found a boat that had been buried in the silt there along the shores of the Sea of Galilee. And as they carefully got it excavated, you can look this up, it's often referred to as the Jesus boat or the Galilee boat. They carefully excavated it, they got it up, and it's mostly just the ribs, but you can see the whole entire structure of the boat is left intact. They were able to salvage that. And it is 27 feet long, it's about 8 feet wide. They say that it would hold about 4 to 5 men, 4 men to row if they weren't using the sail, and then there would also be one in the back to steer and to help pay out the net. So a 5-man crew in these boats. It's interesting to see history validate some of the information that we see as well. Well, they would use the casting nets. They were weighted. They were 10 to 20 feet in diameter. You think of a cowboy throwing the lasso. Imagine trying to throw a net that's round and weighted on the bottom, 10 to 20 feet in diameter, and to throw it in such a way that it would spread out and land on the water flat so that it could sink down and get around the fish. The coordination, the strength that would take to do something like that kind of boggles my mind. I would have a mess. It's bad enough just with a fishing line that I can get tangled up. I can't imagine what a net would look like when I was done with it. They had a couple of different options for drag nets, some in the shallower water, but I think most of what the disciples did was out in deeper water. These large drag nets could be several hundred feet in length, weighted on the bottom with floats on the top, and they would be 24 to 30 feet tall, several fathoms tall, depending on how deep the water was that they were fishing in. And they would go out in the deeper water and they would begin to pay these nets out, usually with multiple boats. One would hold one side fast and the other side would row out, and they would gradually work the net out from the boat without tangling it. And as they would get it out far enough, they would kind of make this little semicircle, and slowly they would bring the ends of that net back together where they would meet. and it's weighted on the bottom, but it's still open. So they would dive down into the water, and they would take those weighted pieces of net, and they would cross them over each other at the bottom to make a bottom for the net, to help enclose the fish. They'd come back to the surface, get back in the boat, and they would work on tightening that net more and more till they could get the fish out of the boat. Sometimes they would have so many fish, and they weren't far from shore, they would bring the whole mess into shore and deal with it that way. But that's how they would do that. They would repeat that process 7 to 8 times during the course of a night. Imagine how much time and effort and strength that would take. And then morning comes, and you're not done yet. You've got to come to shore, and you've got to clean and mend your nets. You've got to process the fish. You get them ready for sale. Sometime in there, you've got to get some food to eat. They probably had food on the boat as well. Sometime you've got to get a little bit of sleep before you start the process all over again. Fishing was not an easy occupation. It was difficult and it was strenuous. It involved teamwork and stamina and perseverance, a strong work ethic. And I think as we look at that, it makes sense why Jesus would look to fishermen to try to find candidates for his school of discipleship. The criteria, the things that these men demonstrated would serve them well as they're following Christ. And so when we think of Peter as this man's man, this blue-collar kind of a guy, used to hard work, big and brawny and tough as nails, a guy that's not going to back down for anyone or anything. I think we can see that he came by that fairly honestly with his occupation, his trade as a fisherman. As I was thinking that through, that gave me a little better perspective of what Peter's life must have been like before he met Christ. Let's move now to the second aspect of Peter's life here that we'll look at today, and we see Peter the follower. Peter the follower, Peter the disciple. Here we could say that Peter goes from being a fisherman to a fisher of men. And I see this breakdown in 3 stages. First of all, we see that he's called to be a disciple of Jesus Christ. Turn to John chapter 1. We're going to look at several scriptures today. Part of it depends on how fast the time goes. I've given many of them to you in your notes that you can follow up on your own later on. But many of these I'd like us to see as we have time. We're going to cover a lot of ground today, but I realize that it's familiar territory. And so I can just allude to things or mention them, and you're going to have a whole other set of thoughts that go to your mind, and that's great. But let's look at this idea here of Peter, first of all, being called to be a disciple of Christ. An initial introduction in John chapter 1, in verse 35. Again, the next day after John stood and 2 of his disciples and looked upon Jesus as he walked, he saith, Behold, the Lamb of God. The timing here is just after the baptism of Jesus. They're there in the wilderness, and it's interesting. Verse 37, the 2 disciples heard him speak, and they followed Jesus. Who are these 2 disciples? Well, it tells us here in a little bit that one is Andrew. The other one is unnamed, but it's in the book of John, so that pretty well narrows it down. It's John. So we have Andrew and John here spending time with John the Baptist. And as they're there, they hear John the Baptist speak, and John the Baptist looks and sees Jesus, and he says, Behold, look over there. That's the Lamb of God. And Andrew and John understand that. And they go and they listen to hear Jesus speak. And in verse 38, it says, Jesus turned and saw them following and said, What do you seek? They said unto him, Rabbi, which is to say, being interpreted, Master, where do you dwell? And he said unto them, Come and see. And they came and saw where he dwelt and abode with him that day, for it was about the 10th hour. They heard Jesus speak. They followed Jesus home back to where he was staying. But something else happens that's significant here. One of the 2, verse 40, that heard him speak and followed him was Andrew, Simon Peter's brother. He first finds his own brother Simon and said unto him, notice this phrase, We have found the Messiah. They made that connection between the Lamb of God and the Messiah, the Christ. We have found him. And he first brings his own brother Simon and brings him to Jesus Christ. Verse 42, he brought him to Christ. And when Jesus beheld him, he said, You are Simon, the son of Jonah. You will be called Cephas, which is the Aramaic term. The Greek term would be Peter, which is by interpretation a stone. They found Jesus. They realized who he was. Andrew went and found his brother Peter and brought him to Christ. And imagine Peter's surprise when Jesus knows him not only by name, but by his family name. That must have caught him a little bit off guard. And then Jesus changes his name for him there as well. I think it's neat to see that they were looking for the Messiah. They were a rough lot of fishermen. There's no doubt about that. And fishermen didn't have the best reputation during that time. They were hardworking. They were blue collar. They were probably a little rough around the edges. But what else do we know about them? There was a knowledge of the Old Testament. They understood it. They understood these connections. They came to listen to John the Baptist preach. I think it's safe to assume they honored the Sabbath and they worshiped in the synagogue. Here we see hardworking men in a difficult trade that still love their Lord and are still working to please Him, even in the midst of a difficult occupation. So we see, first of all, this initial introduction. Let's move next to Mark chapter 1. Back up in your Gospels accounts to Mark and chapter 1. And while you're turning there, I'm going to get a sip of this. It seems like the hot helps. In Mark in chapter 1, and we start down in verse 16. Now as he, Jesus, was walking by the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and Andrew, his brother, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishers or fishermen. Here it's the casting net, and they probably out in the water a little ways, looking for schools of fish, trying to drop the nets on top of them. And Jesus said unto them, Come ye after me, and I will make you to become fishers of men. And straightway they forsook their nets and followed him. Verse 19, he'd gone a little ways further. He saw James, the son of Zebedee, and John, his brother, who also were in the ship mending their nets. And straightway he called them, and they left their father Zebedee in the ship with the hired servants and went after him. Here we see this primary call on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. Jesus sees them casting their nets, and he calls and tells them to follow him. And they leave their nets and they follow. The scene is repeated with James and John. Now, I don't know that this is the final call. There's one more that we're going to look at here, and I think I'm going to call it the permanent call that came further out on the Sea of Galilee a little bit later. And for this, let's look to Luke chapter 5. Luke chapter 5. Now, I'm not 100% sure that the accounts we see in Matthew and Mark are different than the one we see here in Luke. There's some that believe they're still the same account, that Luke just gives more detail, and that's a possibility. It's difficult to determine precisely the chronology between the gospel narratives. It's hard to put it all together. And so we may not get it right all the time. But as I look at this and I see the differences, and I look at the timing of the healing of Peter's mother-in-law through the course of those other gospel accounts, it leads me to believe that this is a separate occasion. That the disciples, Peter and James and John and Andrew, had followed him for a time, maybe for a day or two, and then they came back and they were fishing again. They were using that time to support their family, and maybe they followed Jesus again for a day or two, and then they went back to fishing. They were following him, but it wasn't the full-time discipleship that Jesus was after. And so let's look at this story here in Luke chapter 5. It came to pass, as the people pressed upon him to hear the word of God, he stood by the lake of Gennesaret, the Sea of Galilee. He saw two ships standing by the lake, but the fishermen were gone out of them and were washing their nets. He entered into one of the ships, which was Simon's, it's Peter's boat, and prayed him and said, Thrust out a little from the land. And he sat down and taught the people out of the ship. Here Jesus is teaching on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. The crowd is getting big and they're pressing him. And so he asked Peter, let me get in your boat. Let's push out a little bit from shore. I need some breathing room. There's too many people and they're pressing upon me. And so he teaches from the boat. When he finishes his teaching, we see next his request. And we see that now in verse 4. Now when he had left speaking, he said to Simon, Launch out into the deep and let down your nets for a draft. What does Simon say? He said, Master, we've toiled all night long. We've taken nothing. What's Peter thinking at this time? He's a little bit reluctant to do this. Because in his fisherman's mind, because he does this for a living, Jesus might know a lot of things, but Peter knows fishing. You don't go out in the morning after you fished all night and caught nothing. You got nets, the fish are going to see them. You're not going to catch anything. It's a waste of time. But notice his respect for the Lord. I love this phrase. He said, Master, we've toiled all night, we've taken nothing. Nevertheless, at your word, I'll go let down the net. You know, if you really want me to, Lord, I don't think it's going to work. He probably said under his breath, I don't think we're going to catch anything, but if you want me to go, let's go. That submission to the Lord starts early in Peter's life. That to me is a neat thing that we don't always think about when it comes to Peter. So they go out. I'm sure they finished loading the nets, getting all that taken care of. And it says that they went out. He says, I will let down the net. Verse 6, when they had done this, They enclosed a great multitude of fishes, and their nets broke. What were the results? They put that net out there. They made the circle. They drew it together. He probably dove down and tightened the bottom up, and the net was so full of fish, it was beginning to break. And they began to load the fish into their boats, and it was more than they could take. So they call James and John and say, come over here, we need help. They load more fish into their boat. They couldn't get it all in. Their boats were starting to hang low in the water. From what I understand, those boats could handle a half a ton of fish each, is typically what they could handle along with their crew. That's a lot of fish. Probably the most Peter has ever caught in his life. Now notice Peter's recognition. He sees what's going on. He understands what's happened. And I need to back up and find my spot in the passage. Verse 8, when Simon saw it, he fell down at Jesus' knees, saying, depart from me. I am a sinful man, O Lord. He recognized Jesus for who he was. He recognized himself for who he was. And Jesus reassures him, says, don't be afraid. From now on, you will catch men. And I think it's after this experience that Peter and James and John and Andrew begin following him full time. They bring those fish to shore, and the text says that they left them, they forsook them there. They didn't go to waste. I think Zebedee took those with his hired help, processed them. I think they used that to support their families in the absence of Peter and Andrew and James and John, at least for a time. God was supplying for them. But here, I think, is where he began to follow full time. We see letter B, continued confirmation that Jesus is the Christ. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time here because you're familiar with these stories. Jesus now begins the process of confirming to Peter who Jesus really was. And we see that through his teaching. Jesus teaches like no other rabbi. Think of the Sermon on the Mount. Think of the parables that Jesus gave. But Jesus displays power like no other man. Think about the miracles that Peter witnessed. His power over disease and over weather and over the demons and over death and even over Satan. This was not any ordinary man. This guy was different. And that became very clear to Peter. The sermons and the parables and the miracles were designed to teach and to verify the deity of Christ. And they had that effect on Peter. He became convinced. And that's what we move on to, letter C, a certain confession that Jesus is the Christ. This may or may not be Peter's conversion. There's a lot of discussion about when he truly came to faith in Christ. But there's a conversation at Caesarea Philippi. Flip with me to Matthew chapter 16. Matthew chapter 16. Am I staying close enough to the mic? Are you able to hear me? I know the voice is kind of weak today, so I'll stay close. Matthew chapter 16. Pick it up in verse 13. Jesus came to the coast of Caesarea Philippi, and he said, asked his disciples, who do men say that I, the Son of Man, am? Interesting question. Hey, you're out among the people. Who do they think I am? And they answered, and they said, some say you're John the Baptist, some say Elijah, some Jeremiah, or one of the prophets. And then he looks at them and says, but who do you say that I am? Peter's acknowledged him earlier, quite a bit earlier, that he was his Lord. He's had these confirmations that Jesus Christ is God. And notice what Peter says. He steps up as a spokesman for the group. And he says in verse 16, thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. The recognition by Peter, you are Christ, you are the Son of the living God. You're the Messiah. We know who you are. And then we see Jesus, he gives a revelation to Peter, says, you're blessed. This wasn't revealed to you by man. This was revealed to you by God. Goes on to say that Peter's going to play a significant part in the building of his church. And we don't have time to delve into all of that. But we see that there at Caesarea Philippi. I think this is a different occurrence. Look over in John chapter 6. It's possible that it's the same time and they're just looking at it from a little different angles. Much of what is said is similar. But I think likely this is a separate occurrence. John chapter 6 and down in verse 66. It says, from that time many of his disciples went back and walked no more with him. We remember that Jesus had multitudes following him, and from those multitudes he called out 120. And from that 120 he took 12, and of that 12 he took 3. We'll look at that in a minute. But what's happening is Jesus is realizing that many are following him just for the loaves and the fishes, just for the miracles. And so he begins to preach in a little harder way. He begins to show the difficulty that comes in following Christ. And in so doing, many people are now leaving and they're not following him anymore. In verse 67, Jesus asked the disciples a convicting question, will you also go away? These people are leaving, these disciples, so-called. Will you go away as well? And again, I love Simon's answer. He said, Lord, to whom shall we go? Where else can we go? because you have the words of eternal life. And he goes on and says, and we believe and we are sure. He says it twice. We have a certainty that you are the Messiah. You are the Son of the living God. In these two passages, we see this certain confession that Jesus is the Christ. Peter understood who Jesus was. He was fully convinced in his mind that Jesus was the Messiah. What he thought that was going to lead to, we can have some different perspectives on. I don't know for sure. Did he think the kingdom was going to come immediately? That might be part of it. But he understood and he believed who Jesus Christ was. Well, we see next that Peter is now taken in to be part of this inner circle of Jesus Christ. And I'm not going to look up these individual passages as well, but he was there when his mother-in-law was healed. James and John were, and possibly Andrew. We don't know that the others were. He witnessed the raising of Jairus' daughter from the dead in the book of Luke chapter 8. He was there at the transfiguration. Peter, James, and John, these three that we see at these specific times. And then in the Garden of Gethsemane, he was one of three that was asked to come a little further with Jesus and witness his agony there in the garden. My point is, Peter saw some things the other disciples didn't see. He was chosen to be part of this select group that would see Jesus Christ in a different way, and that would serve him well as God gave him responsibilities later on in his ministry. I want to change directions here just a little bit now in this next point. Still under the idea of Peter as a disciple, as a follower. And here I want to see Peter's confidence and self-reliance being challenged by Jesus Christ. Peter has seen some amazing things. He's made some amazing confessions. But remember how we saw Peter in his role as a fisherman. Blue collar, hardworking, self-reliant. If I need to get it done, I'll dig a little deeper and get it done. One way or another, we're going to get this accomplished. Just like many of you and like many of us. That's how we live our lives. We can get it done. It might mean staying up later. It might mean working harder. It might mean more effort. It might mean whatever. I'm going to get it done. That's Peter's mentality. If they fished all night and came up dry, he dug a little deeper. If the market went down and the prices went down, he found a way to make it happen. Because that's what you do in that situation, especially when you have a business. And yet, I think Jesus wanted to tell Peter that while those traits are valuable for many things, this mindset of self-reliance is the exact thing that would keep him from becoming dependent upon Jesus Christ and becoming dependent upon God. He had to be broken from this I can do it mentality. And so Jesus began breaking Peter of his pride and of his self-sufficiency. And there's more illustrations that we could give of this, but let me give you just 4 here in the time that we have left. First of all, we see that he was challenged by a storm. It's early on in the ministry of Jesus, Mark chapter 4. Jesus says, we're going to the other side. They get into the boat, they take off, and what does Jesus do? He goes to the back of the boat and falls asleep. And sometime in the middle there, a big storm comes there on the Sea of Galilee. But wait a second, he's in a boat, he's on the Sea of Galilee. Isn't that Peter's element? I mean, if anybody would be okay in that situation, it should be Peter. But what happens to Peter and all the rest of the disciples? Fear. They become afraid. There's nothing they can do about the storm. It's greater than anything they can handle. And Jesus gets up after they wake him. Well, how do they wake him? With the words, don't you care that we perish? We see his fear. We see his lack of faith. We see his doubting even the goodness of God. I think Jesus put him in that situation to challenge his self-sufficiency. And then Jesus said, peace be still, calms the storm. And he realizes that while Peter's strength is insufficient, God's strength is sufficient. Secondly, we see he's also challenged by a second storm. We see part 2 in Matthew chapter 14. Here he tells Peter and the disciples, hey, I want you to go to the other side. I'll meet you there. He goes up in a mountain to pray. The disciples take off to go across the Sea of Galilee, and the winds begin to blow. They're making slow progress. They're rowing hard at the oars, but they're not making a lot of headway. And they're getting concerned. And Jesus begins to walk on the water towards them. And I'm not sure, was it the moonlight, the starlight? Somehow they caught a glimpse of him, and what was their first response? We're seeing a ghost. It's an apparition. Our tough, rugged fishermen, the first thing they're going to think is that we saw a ghost. I don't know. That doesn't seem like it's logical to me. But they're afraid. He sees it's Christ coming. At first, they don't know who it is. They cry out in fear, and he identifies who it is. And Peter sees it's Jesus. And he says these words, "Bid me to come to you on the water." That's amazing to me. How can he go from fear to, I'm going to step out of this boat and walk towards him? It's an amazing dichotomy there in the life of Peter. But he steps out of the water, and he indeed walks for a time. We don't know how many steps he takes. But at some point, he begins to see more of the storm and less of Christ, and he begins to sink, and he cries out, "Lord, help me." The Lord brings him back up, but he challenges him on his faith. "Peter, where is your faith?" Again, showing him that his strength is insufficient. "Peter, you can't do all these things on your own." I see a third instance in Matthew chapter 17. You can, again, look these up on your own. And here it's a failed miracle. This individual, this man, takes his son who's demon-possessed to the disciples to have them cast out this demon. They've had the ability to do these miracles. Jesus has given them that power. And here they come, and I'm just going to make an assumption. Maybe it's not accurate, but since Peter was a spokesman for the group so often, I'm wondering if he's the one that this man came to. "Here, cast this demon out of my son. It's tearing him apart." And Peter tries to do it. The disciples try to do it, but they fail. They can't do it. Imagine what that must have been like. This is a public failure. This is an embarrassing failure. This is a gut check failure type of a thing. And Jesus comes along, and he now casts out the demon, and he rebukes the disciples again. He calls them on their lack of faith. And he goes on and adds this kind only comes out but by prayer and fasting. Folks, you're not spending enough time with your God. You're relying upon your own strength instead of upon my strength. You see how Jesus is demonstrating to Peter that he can't do this on his own. We see a fourth instance here, and we'll turn to this one in Matthew chapter 26. We see a bold prediction. Jesus challenges Peter's self-reliance by this bold prediction. Matthew chapter 26. Pick it up in verse 31. Jesus said unto them, "All ye shall be offended because of me this night. For it is written, I'll smite the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock shall be scattered abroad." Jesus is reminding them that he's going to die. My death is coming close. And he says, you're all going to scatter from me. You're going to be offended. You're going to leave me and scatter. Verse 32, "But after I'm risen again, I'll go before you into Galilee." And Peter answered and said, "Though all men should be offended because of thee, yet will I never be offended." "No, Lord, that's not going to happen. I love you too much to forsake you." There's no way that's going to happen. He boldly asserts that. And he even says, if everybody else forsakes you, I'm going to stay with you. I love you that much. Luke adds the comment that Satan desired to sift him like wheat, that he would fail. And the idea is that he would. And then Jesus says, when you're restored, go and strengthen your brothers. That's part of the passage there in the book of Luke. Peter goes on to say, I'm ready to go to prison with you. I'm even willing to die with you and for you. And what does Jesus boldly predict? He says, before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. Peter, you're going to deny me. You're going to forsake me. And it's going to happen soon. And Peter vehemently reiterates his willingness to die before denying his Lord. I'll not deny you. I'll go to death before I deny you. And all the disciples rally behind Peter and say, we will too. We know how that ended. And that brings us to number 3, where we see Peter's failure. And remember, this is only taking place in a matter of a few short hours. Peter goes from self-reliance and confidence to shame and brokenness as the Lord does allow Satan to sift him as wheat. We're here in Matthew chapter 26. If you were to read down in the passage, starting even at verse 36, we see them going to the Garden of Gethsemane. And we've already mentioned that Jesus has Peter and James and John come with him a little bit further. And we see 3 times where Peter trades sleep for prayer in the garden. Jesus says, stay and pray, and he doesn't. He falls asleep. And the last time he falls asleep, Jesus lets them sleep, and finally he wakes them up and says, the enemy's here, Judas is here. And I'm sure Peter wakes up in a fog, and the lights are coming towards him, and the multitude, and he sees the light reflecting off the armor, and he's fearful. But he remembers his boast, and so he pulls his sword and he takes a swing. And he removes the ear from Malchus, and Jesus says, no. I think he expected Jesus to do his part. Well, Jesus did his part. It just wasn't what Peter thought it was going to be. And Jesus tells him to put his sword back away. And overcome by fear, we see Peter doing exactly what Jesus said he would do, forsaking his Lord, running from the scene with the rest of the disciples. I'll give Peter a little credit. At some point, he gathered what was left of his courage and he began to follow afar off. Somehow John gets him into the courtyard there where the trial is taking place, and he's there by the fire, and you know the story. I don't have to give it to you word by word. But there around the fire, he denies his Lord 3 times. The final time he denies with an oath. He swears, "I don't know this man." And as soon as he does that, the rooster crows. And they're in close enough proximity that they can see each other. Jesus turns and he looks at Peter, and their eyes lock. And I think at that moment, Peter remembers the words of Christ. "You will deny me 3 times. You will forsake me." Overcome with shame and with guilt, he runs out of the courtyard, and it says he runs out weeping bitterly. That's not the strong Peter that we see earlier, but it's the process that Jesus has to take him through to become the strong Peter that we see in the book of Acts. It's a hard place to leave Peter, but we've got to do it. He's broken and he's discouraged, he's defeated. There's an overwhelming sense of personal failure. He realizes that he's disappointed the one that he loves more than anything else in the world. Have you ever been there? Or you disappointed somebody you loved? If so, you have a little bit of an understanding of what Peter's feeling. And I'd love to stay another hour and finish the story and see the happy ending, but I think it's beneficial for us to stop here and park here for a little bit. Meditate upon this a little bit. You know, the resolution didn't come for Peter immediately either. What I'd like you guys to do over the next few days is to think about what those next 3 days were like for Peter. Put yourself in his shoes. The Gospels are fairly silent. We don't have anything from the Gospel record. You'll have to use a little sanctified imagination. Don't write your own biblical story, but think about it. What were the emotions that were going through his mind? Where did he go? What did he do? You know, there's no record of Peter at Golgotha. Did he stay far back in the shadows so he could still see it but not close enough to be caught? Or did he run away as far as he could from that ugly scene? Did he participate in the Sabbath the next day? I don't know. Was he even able to eat? Had his appetite left him completely? I imagine he tried to pray. How did that go? Was he so broken up that he couldn't even get words out? He just sat there in numb silence as the tears came down his cheeks? I don't know. But I think it's healthy for us to think about this a little bit. What turmoil must have devastated his heart as he wondered if he'd ever see his Lord again? All these emotions and thoughts going through his head. We'll pick up the story next week and we'll see what God did. But what is God doing right now? I think God is teaching Peter the most important lesson of his life. A lesson that, as we'll see next week, completely transformed this disciple from a self-reliant failure to a God-empowered apostle who literally turned the world upside down for the cause of Christ. It's this event right here that made that possible. The Peter we see in the book of Acts is radically different from the man that we see in the Gospels. And it came about because of this incredible failure. I want to leave us with this thought. On the heels of that, I know that's a hard place to leave it, but let's think about this for a moment. Failure is not final as long as God's grace is operable. One of my teachers said that years ago in Bible college, and it stuck with me. Failure is not final as long as God's grace is operable. And what did we learn last week? God's grace is sufficient. God's grace is always there. It never runs out. My friends, there may be failures in your life. There will be failures in my life. But God wants to do a work through those failures to bring us closer to Him, make us more reliant upon Him, less reliant upon ourselves. And when He brings us through those failures to the other side, we will be more usable in His service. We just have to work with Him in the process. What He's about to do for Peter, He can do for you and He can do for me as well. And that's just a wonderful testimony to the grace of God.